Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
It's great to be here.
How are you doing? I'm really energized for this one. We're tackling something that I think gets overlooked a lot in traditional studies. The deep mechanics of being wrong.
That's it. And that is exactly where the real intellectual work lies. Today we're focusing less on historical truths and more on the profound structure of error itself. We're looking at two really critical concepts, Gaflet,
Which is like negligence.
Yeah.
Carelessness.
Exactly. And Dalalet, which is, it's more like delusion, a deep structural error.
Right, because when we study history, we usually, we celebrate the moment someone got something right. Copernicus, Newton, Einstein.
Of course, the heroes.
But what the sources we're looking at reveal is that understanding how errors are made, and maybe more importantly how they're maintained, is often way more insightful. Errors really dictate the intellectual terrain for centuries.
Precisely. If we look at the sweep of philosophical history, we see that the architecture of certain mistakes, it provides a framework for understanding human thought itself. And here's the key thing. An error doesn't exist in a vacuum.
You can't just pull a single thread.
You can't. If you try to fix one flawed assumption, that assumption was baked into a whole comprehensive system. So your fix often just leads to a new error based on a slightly different and, an equally flawed premise.
That's a huge distinction. We're sort of trained to think of mistakes as singular events, a wrong number in a calculation.
Right.
But in intellectual history, they're cumulative. They're layered. The sources call it a pie of mistakes, which I love. Each generation just bakes in a new layer of assumption.
And if you want to solve a really deeply rooted mistake, one that defines an entire era, you don't just solve what's on top. You have to peel back, sometimes millennia of intellectual investment.
Wow.
And this is where it gets really insidious. The most poisonous element of this cumulative error is that there are undeniable, verified truths baked into those flawed layers.
So the lie becomes irresistible because it contains bits of truth.
That's it, exactly. Those correct points, the observational facts everyone agrees on, they act as the intellectual glue. They give the entire flawed system its internal, its irresistible consistency.
You recognize one part is true, and so you just assume, maybe unconsciously, that everything attached to it must also be true.
And that gives the whole system the stability it needs to last for hundreds or even thousands of years.
And this seems to touch on the danger of just intellectual confidence itself. The sources talk about a kind of human narcissism, about knowledge, this really intense desire to believe we're learning, that we're on a clear path to truth.
Well, it's the drive for complete explanation. We can't stand a vacuum, a theoretical hole. If a system explains, say, 90% of what we see, we're more than willing to forgive or ignore the 10% that doesn't quite fit.
Because the alternative is admitting we just don't know.
And having to start all over again, which makes intellectual self-reflection, constantly interrogating your own assumptions. It becomes a kind of essential self-care, epistemological self-care.
Which brings us to that really stunning paradox. So much ignorance is only possible through education.
It's one of the most powerful insights. Pure ignorance is actually pretty easy to fix. You just provide the facts. But learned assumptions, ideas we spent years studying, that we were tested on, that we built careers on.
Those are protected.
They're protected by layers of ego, professional investment, institutional inertia. You have to be educated, sometimes highly educated, to buy into and defend a system that's flawed enough to last 2,000 years. The investment protects the mistake.
And speaking of glorious, self-consistent errors that lasted 2 millennia, we have to talk about Aristotle.
Of course.
His massive intellectual system somehow managed to, beautifully and erroneously, manage the entire European, Christian, Islamic, and Jewish intellectual tradition for thousands of years.
It was a theoretical monolith. His genius wasn't in being right about everything. It was in building a framework that was so fully comprehensive, so perfectly internally consistent, that it could absorb new challenges without just collapsing. It was a complete operating system for the cosmos.
And when you look at his errors, you can really see that distinction between Gaflet and Dalalet. Some mistakes are just carelessness. Gaflet, like his social observations, his arguments justifying natural slavery based on this idea of natural hierarchies, or famously that women have fewer teeth than men.
An easily verifiable assay. He should have just counted. It's negligence. But what's really enduring are his conceptual errors, his structural delusions, the Dalalet. Those were architecturally sound.
And so much harder to dismantle.
Far harder.
So let's break that down, that cosmic structure.
Yeah.
You basically split the universe into two completely different zones.
That's the foundation of the Grand Era, yes. First, you have the sublunary realm, everything beneath the sphere of the moon. Our Earth, right at the center of everything.
And this realm is all about change, decay, corruption.
And movement in straight lines, linear motion. This is where things are born and die.
Okay, and then above that?
You have the perfect, eternal, unchangeable, superlunary realm. Above the moon. This is the home of the celestial spheres, where all motion is perfect. It's circular.
And in our sublunary realm, we have the four elements: earth, water, air, fire.
Right. And they all have their own inherent natural tendencies.
Okay, so a rock is made of earth, so its natural tendency is to seek the center of the universe.
That's why it falls. And fire is light. It seeks the outer edge, the circumference of the sublunary sphere.
Which is why smoke rises.
Exactly. This explained all terrestrial activity, but it created a huge theoretical problem. If the heavens, the sun, the moon, stars are supposed to be perfect and eternal, they can't be made of these corruptible, changing four elements.
And they can't move in straight lines. Their motion has to be eternally circular.
Which means you need something else.
The fifth element, aether.
The ether. It wasn't a physical discovery, it was a pure theoretical necessity. It was the only way to logically connect what they observed on Earth change with the a priori assumption of perfection and eternal motion in the heavens.
That is a classic structural delusion.
Yeah.
The error wasn't failing to see aether. The error was the initial assumption that the celestial bodies had to be perfect.
Exactly. And that system was so robust, so intellectually rigorous, that when the contradictory evidence finally mounted in the 16th, 17th centuries, you couldn't just swap the Earth for the sun.
Right. It wasn't a simple fix.
If you pulled that one geocentric pin, the entire framework, the elements, the natural movements, the aether, all of it, the whole thing collapsed.
You had to, as you said, refound the entire universe. Start from scratch.
It's hard for us now to really grasp the scale of that. For 2,000 years, that system was woven into Christian theology, through Aquinas, into Islamic philosophy, into all scientific inquiry. Criticizing it wasn't just a scientific debate, it was undermining the entire intellectual order of the world.
The scale is staggering.
Yeah.
But this monumental system and its errors, it brings us to the progression of intellectual confidence needed to even build something like that in the first place.
Well, you can see a clear path of increasing assertion, right? From Socrates to Plato and then to Aristotle.
Socrates is the model of intellectual humility. The wisest man, because he was the one who claimed to know nothing.
And he wrote nothing.
Absolutely nothing. He focused on practical questions. How do we live well? How do we educate the young? He's like the most famous director who never actually made a film.
An intellectual Teflon coat, nothing to pin on him. Then you get Plato. He wrote a lot, but he used fictional voices in his dialogues, which creates this distance, this plausible deniability. He rarely speaks as himself.
But then Aristotle.
Aristotle writes extensively, speaks entirely in his own systematic voice, and fundamentally believed the world was fully knowable, classifiable, and could be structured.
So the increase in confidence in assertion correlates directly with the scale of the systemic errors.
It seems to. What's often missed in that story is that even as this massive system was being built, the academic culture of the time was one of intense critical freedom. Aristotle's own students, like Theophrastus, felt totally empowered to critique him, and Aristotle spent his career critiquing Plato.
That's a great point. So the greatest centers of learning were actually encouraging debate, not just submission to authority. That tension was essential.
Yes, even if the resulting structure was eventually proven flawed, it was part of the process.
Let's pivot back to that idea of observation and negligence, the Gaflet. There's another great example for this. The bees.
Right. Aristotle was a true pioneer of natural science. I mean, he was the father of the empirical data collection bucket. He didn't just sit and theorize. He gathered observations from beekeepers, fishermen, farmers. He documented the world he could see.
But his system broke down when he had to deal with things he couldn't see, like honeybees.
He was completely stumped by how they reproduce. The crucial event, the queen mating with the drones, happens way up in the air. A nuptial flight. It's totally invisible to an observer on the ground.
So because he couldn't see it.
He had to use theoretical necessity. He concluded they were generated asexually, that they just spontaneously walked into being when the conditions were right.
With a huge observational failure leading to a theoretical, a patch, basically.
Yeah.
A guess.
A Gaflet. And to make it worse, he projected his own political reality onto the hive. He didn't call the reproductive female a queen. He called her the king.
So he's projecting the Athenian monarchical, patriarchal worldview directly onto his science.
It's a perfect illustration of how our contemporary worldview shapes scientific interpretation. He saw a monarchy because that was the only social structure he could imagine as being supreme. He didn't just get the gender wrong, he got the entire political structure of the hive wrong.
In this seemingly simple observational error, it lasted for almost 2,000 years. And it wasn't solved by just, a smarter philosopher.
No, not at all. It took until the 19th century with scientists like Francois Huber who developed better observation methods, glass-sided hives, better instruments, to finally figure it out.
So sometimes, to overcome a foundational error, you don't just need better thinking. You need a new instrument.
The technology of observation has to catch up to the complexity of reality. That's a huge takeaway.
So if this whole history of magnificent mistakes teaches us anything, it's that we are probably sitting inside our own massive, unexamined architecture right now.
I think we have to assume that. First, let's consider the intellectual environment itself. Let's go back to the Greek concept of school. Leisure time. It's the root of our word school.
Right.
Deep philosophical thinking historically required time free for manual labor. Leisure was a prerequisite for intellectual freedom.
Which poses a huge modern challenge. In a world where deep reflective time is a luxury for most people, the widespread access to that kind of thought, to true school, is shrinking.
Absolutely. The lack of equitable access to reflective leisure, you can almost call that a systemic gaflet in our current society. We're sacrificing the conditions for deep, corrective thought for immediate economic needs.
And then there's the technology shift. The old saying was, the word flies, but the writing remains.
And now that is completely reversed. Spoken, recorded speech video remains forever.
This creates an incredible pressure. Every single word you speak can be endlessly cross-referenced against every other word you've ever said. The expectation for consistency it's just radically different.
If you are Socrates today, producing this shifting, sometimes contradictory body of thought, the modern world would just crucify you for the inconsistencies.
The pressure might actually prevent the next great innovator from emerging if they're too afraid of the cost of being productively, gloriously inconsistent.
They're forced into a kind of intellectual conservatism just to maintain a clean record. We're in the first millisecond of the Big Bang of this new information structure. We have no idea what the long-term impact will be.
So if we connect all this back, the history of error tells us we're almost certainly living inside our own massive, self-consistent Dalalet right now, blinded by our own consensus, whatever that might be.
And so the most productive intellectual strategy really is still Socratic humility, the willingness to just admit, I might not know this, or even what I said yesterday might be flawed. You have to accept ignorance as a natural, necessary state, not as a failure.
We have to actively work to lower the social and intellectual cost of making mistakes, because error isn't the opposite of growth.
It is essential to it. It's just more data.
So if you look at these grand errors of the past, they were glorious in their scope, their consistency.
They were. So based on everything we've talked about, systemic error, institutional pressure, intellectual narcissism, the question for you to take away is this. What great, glorious 21st century mistake are we currently living inside? Something that is perfectly self-consistent and entirely invisible to us right now. That's the question worth spending your own school time on.